Alrighty then. I wonder how many times I've started a video like that, especially across all my classes. It's really all I know, and it's awkward, and so here I am, saying alrighty then. And it's not even like my catchphrase or anything. I think Jim Carrey says it somewhere, in some movie or show from the 90s. Anyways, we're here now. We might as well start. We don't really have a choice now, do we? So up to this point, we've discussed, but I guess you've discovered. I have discussed, you've discovered. Very broad things, or themes, that's a much better word. Very broad themes about research methods. And today we're going to start honing it in. So we started off with that sort of primer. Why do we conduct research, right? What is science? What is knowledge? And then we went into ethics, and the main point that we needed to get from that was, well, if we're going to do something and there are some ethical shenanigans there, right, we need to weigh things properly here. We need to make sure that when we're conducting research with human beings, that there's more benefit and justice for everyone than us just hurting a bunch of people or embarrassing them or harming them in some way. And then last time we talked about the process of conceptualization. So how do we take an idea that we have for research and turn it into something measurable? So those are sort of 4 things that we needed to cover before we start talking about individual types of research designs, okay? Yeah. So essentially, if you were to think back on the conceptualization video, right, we sort of went down that Christmas tree that was upside down that made me want ice cream. We're now at the tip, right? We're at measurement, right? How do we collect this data? Well, there are many designs, and different designs have different types of... I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, benefits and drawbacks, advantages and disadvantages. And depending on the situation, depending on what question you're asking, depending on what your what your conceptual definition is, different ways to operationalize or different designs will be more appropriate. And also sometimes, you just don't have all the money in the world. Sometimes you work at a teaching college where research is not such a big deal, and so there's much more emphasis on doing research with local practitioners. So, yeah. Okay. So, the designs then that we're going to talk about today are experimental and quasi-experimental designs. Some people like to say quasi. I like to say quasi. Quasi just sounds like, I don't know. It's just not my vibe. My vibe is quasi. Your vibe might be quasi, but don't try to make me say quasi, because I say quasi. Because that's my vibe. And my vibes are chill vibes, man. I'm chill. Okay. So, in theory, the classical experiment. So if we were to say, what is the epitome of an experiment? What is the quintessential experiment? I'd say to you, well, buddy, there are 3 things that are important to the quintessential, classical, perfect experiment. You must have an independent variable and a dependent variable. And we'll talk about that in a second. Also, we've actually already talked about what an independent and a dependent variable is in the 3rd video. Or technically the 4th video because, there was the intro video. But you know what I'm saying. Right? There must be an independent variable, so something that you put into the situation and it changes another variable, or you expect it to change another variable, which is the dependent variable. Remember, the independent variable, you introduce it. The dependent variable is dependent on the existence or the presence of the independent variable. You must also have pre-testing and post-testing, right? So you measure your dependent variable before you enter your independent variable into the equation. And then after it's been entered, you test it again, right? So if I want to know if drinking alcohol makes me pass a field sobriety test, well, then I'll first complete the field sobriety test, like do the thing where you touch your nose and like the ABCs backwards and all that shenanigans. I'll first do that when I'm sober, and then I will drink, I don't know, I don't really drink a lot, so I guess I will have a sip of beer, and then I will do the same thing again, right? So you test me while I'm sober, you introduce the independent variable, which is alcohol, and then you test me again on the dependent variable, which is my performance on the field sobriety test. And then you must have an experimental group and experimental group and a control group. Now, before we get too crazy, sometimes you'll hear me say experimental group, sometimes you'll hear me say the treatment group, sometimes you'll hear me say the test group. All three of those things mean the same. So let's whip out this little thingy-majig. Thingy-majig! Aha! So you'll hear me, so experimental group can be the same as test group. It can be the same as, what was the other one I was saying? Oh, treatment group. What was the other one? Was there another one? Test group, experimental group, treatment group. Yeah, I guess those three. They are the same thing, depending on who you ask. Different people will use different names for them, and I'm sure there's some other name that I'm forgetting now, okay? But the experimental or test or treatment group are the groups that get the independent variable. They get the thing that you're trying to test. Whereas the control group is not. They get nothing. Things are staying the same, right? The reason for it is, I'll explain that to you a little later, for why we need those things. But these right here are the three elements of the quintessential or classical experiment. So now how do I change? So let's talk about independent and dependent variables again. I feel like I should do commercials, like voiceover work for commercials. My wife says I should do that, but I feel like my wife just wants me to feel good on the inside, and so she tells me I'm good at things that I'm not really that good at, just so that she's, just so that I can feel good about myself. So she tells me, oh yeah, you should have done this or that, or you're so good at playing guitar. When in all reality, she's sitting there, she's like, oh my gosh, why did I marry this person? Anyways, not to start talking about that, but an independent variable, again, is the thing that you introduce into the experiment. It is the thing that you think is going to do something to something else. So within the pandemic, right, the coronavirus vaccine is an independent variable. The hydrochloroquine plus zinc is an independent variable. It's not effective, remember. Sometimes we also call it a stimulus, right? It is what you put into the situation, all right? In criminal justice, an independent variable can be hotspots policing, right? In another criminal justice example could be sentencing guidelines. Another criminal justice example could be drug treatment, or mental health court, or drug court, or juvenile court, right? Some sort of thing that you think is going to cause different outcomes. The nice thing, the way to think about an independent variable is that it is the thing that you put into the experiment and you expect it to stay the same. All right. So let's think about like drug court, right? When you send a person to drug court, that person, you expect that person to leave the drug court program after how many months or years, or actually it's usually just like a couple months, weeks, or a year. You expect that person to be changed. But you don't expect the drug court to be different because of that person, right? You don't expect hotspots policing, right? The act of conducting hotspots policing, you don't expect that to change, right? Or alcohol, right? Alcohol is alcohol. Beer is beer before and after you drink it, right? Now, the individual beer that you're drinking gets broken down by your liver, but the independent variable, which is alcoholic beer, is alcoholic beer regardless, right? So that's how to think of it. The independent variable is a thing that you're introducing and you're not expecting it to change in itself. You're expecting something else to change because you introduced it. And that's where our dependent variable comes in. Sorry, I just had some more tea. The dependent variable is our outcome, okay? An outcome or an effect or what we expect to change, all right? So if we are introducing, if we're saying to someone, you are going to drug court for all the drugs you've done, right? And they go to drug court and they finish drug court. The dependent variable in that would be reoffending. Okay, so let's create an experiment. Here's our experiment. We have randomly selected 200 people in New York City who have been charged with some form of opioid possession, and we take these people and we randomly place 100 of them into our experimental group and 100 of them in our non-experiment or in our control group, right? And we take our experimental group and we say, you guys all do drug court for 6 weeks or whatever. Okay, and we say to the control group, you go to jail or you get your ticket or whatever the normal punishment is, right? And then we go and we say, okay, great. Drug court group goes to drug court, and the control group goes to whatever the traditional punishments are. And then, let's say 2 years later, we look these people's records up and we see, have they had any contacts with the police? Yes or no. And then also we might also want to look at, did they have any other drug offenses? Or we might survey them and ask them, have you done any drugs since your last whatever it was, since you completed your punishment or your drug court. And then we're seeing is overall crime or recidivism, has that outcome been impacted? Or we're looking at drug use, has that outcome been impacted or changed because of the drug court, right? So our independent variable is drug court, and we give that to half of our participants, which are our experimental group, and then we see, hey, to what extent have two outcomes changed because of drug court? And the one outcome is reoffending in general, and the other outcome is drug use, if at all, right? And you can measure this either through a survey or by looking at records, right? Both of those methods have their strengths and weaknesses and ethical considerations to worry about. So then, in the case of when we test the impacts of body-worn cameras on police complaints, which do you think is the independent variable and which thing do you think is the dependent variable? If we're testing the usage of body-worn cameras if we're introducing body-worn cameras into the equation, and then we're testing to see if there's any change in police complaints or complaints filed against the police by citizens, which one do you expect to be the independent variable and dependent variable? If you're sitting there, you're like, body-worn cameras are the independent variable, well, guess what? You're correct. And you deserve a piece of chocolate or a pat on the back. I just went through our pantry. We have no chocolate in the house, and it's depressing me. So I put honey in my tea for a little pick-me-up. But I prefer dark chocolate. Click. All right, pre-testing and post-testing. We already talked about that a little bit. But essentially, you want to measure you want to measure the dependent variable before you introduce the independent variable. You want to say, hey, what's the baseline for the dependent variable? And then you say, okay, bam! Independent variable. Now, what does it say? Right? So, what's a good example? Oh, yes. So I did a study at my previous university with another professor. She's like my best friend. Her name is Dr. Brooke Mathna. She now teaches at Longwood University in Virginia. But she and I did a study with our policing classes in Evansville, Indiana. And essentially what we did was she and I both taught Intro to Policing there. And what we did was we took all of our Intro to Policing classes across 5 sections. So across 3 semesters, between she and I, we taught 5 sections of this class. And so we told these students at the beginning of the class, on the very first day of class, before they were even asked to know or learn anything about the police, we gave them a survey about how they viewed the police and about what their career aspirations were. Then, as a part of the class, we made them all do police ride-alongs. Okay? They all did police ride-alongs. And then, after they did their police ride-alongs, we gave them the exact same survey again. And we measured whether, after introducing the independent variable, which is police ride-alongs, whether that changed one of two outcomes. And that is, did it change the way they viewed the police? Also, did it change the way they viewed their career aspirations? And guess what? It made them view the police in a more positive light. Only if the police officer conducting the ride-along was not a jerk. Makes sense, doesn't it? And then also, we did see some change in police in career expectations. More students were like, oh, I want to be a cop. Right? So yeah, that's pre-test and post-test. You test pre-test is you take the baseline before you introduce the independent variable, and then you take the whatever measurement after the introduction of the independent variable. And that's why you need to have a control group, okay? And that was one of the weaknesses of our studies. We did not have a control group. We just had everyone was in the study. And so technically that's then a quasi-experimental design, but that's neither here nor there. But if you have a control group, right? So let's say we did have another 5 sections of policing students, and then we gave them the survey, did not make them go on a ride along, and then gave them the survey again. And then we can say, oh, well, look at our 2 groups and how they changed or did not change, right? Maybe it was the fact that they were in a policing class that changed their views. Now, you're saying, how did you protect for that in your perceptions experiment? Well, what we did was we added questions to the survey that would help sort of control for the for what students would have learned in class. And we also made sure students did the ride-alongs as soon as possible in the beginning of the semester to expose them to as little as possible stuff. So again, right, so no research is 100% perfect, and in our case, that was one of our major flaws, right? So we had some validity issues, and we tried our best to mitigate those. I don't like talking bad of my own research. Okay, let's have some more tea. Yes. So we just talked about experimental groups and control groups. But again, your experimental group is whatever gets the treatment or the policy or the drugs or the hydrochloroquine plus zinc. If you're a believer in our dear leader's rhetoric, I'm not. So that's the group that gets whatever the thing is, and then the control group gets nothing. You get nothing. Right, so let's think of a medical example. Maybe a wonder drug is created that cures the coronavirus, and then we can all go back to our normal lives, and I don't have to sit here by myself in a room and scream at a microphone. Because it's weird. Because in reality, I'm not talking to anyone. I'm just talking to myself in a room in my house. Anyways, so let's pretend we came up with a coronavirus vaccine that works, right? And so actually right now I think there's an actual vaccine that's being tested, and I think whoever the company is, in order to meet the regulations set by the United States government, and I think it's the FDA, you have to have a 50% success rate. And so this company started a study that has 30,000 subjects in it. Okay, that's a massive sample. That's amazing. Okay. And so I think what's happening is half of the sample is getting the drug, and the other half of the sample is getting a placebo, which we'll talk about here in a second. A placebo is a control. It's nothing, but they think it's something, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. But anyways, that's your control group. And so you're giving the one group, bam, coronavirus vaccine, giving the other group nothing, and you're seeing if there's any differences in the way that they respond to the coronavirus, right? Do fewer people get it? Are people cured from it? What's going on? Okay. So another example might be to have a group of like a group of people who are suffering with a certain disease, and then you give half of that group a pill, and you see if that disease is then mitigated by that pill, right? But one major ethical consideration, and this is what we have to think about, is, so let's say you are treating cancer, right? Or you're experimenting a new cancer treatment, which I just heard about today. These doctors in, I think, Australia found a lot of support in an experiment where honeybee venom is being used to attack breast cancer cells, which is amazing. If they can actually do something real, like have some real advances in that. Anyways, so let's say it works for like 90% of your experimental group. Now, from an ethical standpoint, you have to go tell the control group, hey, here's the treatment for you now too, because this stuff really worked, right? What would be unethical would be to be like, okay, see ya. We just saved 50% of our group's lives, but, you guys happen to fall in the control group, so good luck to you. No, you have to give them the freaking same treatment if you see it works. Ooh, here's a fun question. Can we have more than one experimental/treatment/test group? What do you think? if you're thinking, yeah, I think so, well, then you're right. Let's come up with an example that you all might not understand. Obviously, you understand it, but that you might relate to it or get it, right? So let's say we're in a highly unethical situation, okay? And I want to test, as a researcher, is there a correlation? Is there a direct correlation between the amount of Adderall consumed and outcomes on a test? Okay, so let's say this researcher gives an examination to 300 students, all right? And again, this is probably pretty unethical. And so now I'm like, okay, well, I'm wondering, actually, no, let's say there's 500 students, all right? 500 students all gonna take the same exam. Now I wanna know, if I give some students 5 milligrams of Adderall and other students 10 milligrams of Adderall and other students 15 milligrams of Adderall and other students 20 milligrams of Adderall and then some students no Adderall, is there going to be a relationship between the amount of Adderall consumed and test scores? So if I take more Adderall, will I do better on my tests? Okay, so now you go and you say, okay, we have 500 students. Randomly put 100 of them in your control group. They get a placebo or a sugar pill that is nothing. You take another 100, you put them in the 5 milligram group. You take another 100, you put them in the 10 milligram group. You take another 100, you put them in the 15 milligram group. And then the last 100 get 20 milligrams of Adderall, and they're going to be jacked out of their minds. And now you have them all take the same test. Okay? And then you compare the 5 groups to one another. And you say, okay, it looks like the more Adderall you take, the better. Or it might be like, actually, there's a sweet spot around 15 milligrams. If you start taking 20 milligrams, you get too stuck in the weeds, right? You get too sucked into that one answer, and you spend your whole freaking test time answering that one essay question. You forget everything else because you're so concentrated. And so in that case, you had one control group, but you had 4 different experimental groups. This actually happens a lot in criminal justice research where you want to test the effect strength. You want to see, does the amount or the quality or the nature of independent variable that I introduce impact a certain dependent variable? Does that make sense? I hope so. I feel like with each video, I get crazier and crazier. Oh, here we are, placebo slide. Well, I guess I already spoiled it for you. The thing is, the human mind is quite extraordinary. Extraordinary! My dog is looking at me like I'm a crazy person. I think my dog thinks I'm mad at him because I'm screaming at the microphone, and he's like, what am I doing? I'm just laying here. So the human mind, right? Sometimes when you tell a human being, look, you just took a magic pill. And then all of a sudden, you think you just took a magic pill, and you're like, yeah, I feel this. Right? Who here has ever maybe taken CBD, right? And you're like, oh, whoa, it really like calms down my anxiety. Or maybe you've taken lavender oil, and you're like, whoa, it really like calms my anxiety down. Right? There's not a lot of academic research that supports that, right? The CBD is a little more mixed because it depends on the type of CBD you take. But anyways, I'm not saying CBD is bad. There's a lot of science that shows a lot of good things for it. Has it been really replicated? No. Is there some sort of placebo effect when it comes to stuff like anxiety and depression? Yes. Anyways, sometimes when you think you're taking a certain medicine or you're doing something good, you feel better. You think your mind is telling you that you feel better. it's sort of like the opposite of how hypochondria works, right? I'm a hypochondriac because I'm anxious all the time. When the whole coronavirus pandemic started, every time my throat just hurt a little bit, I thought I had coronavirus. And the worst part about it was I was living in Indiana for most of that, where, first of all, a lot of people believed it was a hoax. Other people took objection to it, and you couldn't ever get tested for it unless you actually had a fever or were in contact with someone. So I couldn't get tested. Here in New York, when I got here, I got tested because I can. Because New York, as much as you might not like certain things about the state, is a great state to live in. Yeah, it is. And if you don't trust me, I implore you to go live in Indiana for a while. Anyway, so a placebo is, so when you're testing something like a HIV drug, for instance, right? And you give the group of people who are you give the treatment group the actual HIV drug, and they start feeling like they're getting better or whatever, right? It might just be the placebo effect. And so by giving the control group a placebo, you can actually test whether the improvements you're seeing on your dependent variable are actually because of the drug or the placebo effect. So a placebo effect is when you take something and you think it's working. And then for some reason, your body starts to show signs that it's working. Or you think that it's working. And this is often the case with stuff like psychoactive drugs or like stuff that's aimed at curing anxiety or whatever, right? And so people who take the placebo then need to know, well, they don't know that they're actually taking just a sugar pill, and they don't have anything. So if they feel like they're getting better, it's just a placebo effect. So in a perfect world, what you want to do is you want to have a 100% control group that gets no placebo, a placebo control group, and then an experimental group. Because then you can see to what extent the placebo effect impacted both the control group 2, the placebo group, and the experimental groups, right? And I realize now as I'm saying this, the HIV drug example is probably not a good one for the placebo effect, although there is, again, some people are saying that you can even see like physiological differences sometimes, but I think it's more appropriate for things like taking lavender oil for concentration, or taking CBD for anxiety or whatever, right? But again, sometimes you want to have a placebo group so that you can make sure that it's not the idea of taking something that's actually helping someone change their dependent variable. Then there's some other things to consider that makes an experiment even better, right? So a blind experiment is when respondents, or when your participants don't know whether they're in the control or experimental group, right? So that's why you give a placebo, because you're taking it and you're like, oh, I don't know whether I actually am taking the anxiety drug or not, right? But a double-blind experiment is when the researcher themselves doesn't know which participants are in which group, right? So some other entity or some randomization tool or something figures out who gets what, who's in which group. And all the researchers know is they're just recording each person's data, and then when the whole thing is done, people are split into respective groups. The reason for this is, and this is especially the case when it comes to something like treatment programs, or when it comes to something like medical research, right? Oftentimes what happens is, right, I'm the researcher, I just created this drug that I think will cure everyone of cancer, okay? Just think about that for a second. The person who comes up with the cure for cancer will never, ever, ever have to worry about finances ever again in their life. The person who comes up with the cure for cancer will be one of the richest people ever. Ever. Like some Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk type of shenanigans, okay? So, now I have come up with a drug that I am pretty damn sure will cure cancer, right? And so I know now who my experimental and control groups are. And the control group's getting their placebo, and I know exactly each one of them who's getting their placebo, and the experimental group is getting my actual pill that I created, and I'm giving it to them. But I really want this to work because I can almost taste the planes and the yachts and the Armani suits and the fame, and I'll be able to travel the whole world. I can buy a condo, or I can buy a whole condo complex in Monaco. I can taste it. So now I go to all of my experimental group people and I say, hey buddy, how about you eat, just don't worry about eating, don't eat any red meat. Don't touch any plastics, right? No need to put deodorant on because that's aluminum in there and there's been some correlations. Just take care of yourself. You're doing things that might also influence the dependent variable because you really want your drug to work. You really want your drug to hit that 50% threshold so that it can be sold to the public. You really want that success, right? That's not science though, and there's some serious ethical considerations with that. So when it comes to stuff like that, you double blind it and it just automatically ups the integrity of your study. You don't know who's getting what. So if you do start, feeding other things in to people, by the law of randomness, you'll probably impact the dependent variables of people in both groups. So that's why we use double-blind experiments. Randomization is necessary in order to eliminate any sort of bias. Right? Think of it like this, right? If I don't so according to the laws of randomness, right? So let's say we have here's a group of people, right? And we have a bunch of dot people. Then we have a few circle or weird squiggly thing people. We have some X people. Put a couple more dot people in there. We want to have mostly dot people. And then we have a square person here, and a square person here, right? If I were to, in a non-systematic way or a non-random way, select people, just based on, if I'm like, all right, everyone who wants to be in my study, and like the first people who say they want to participate, I just put them in my experimental group, and then once I have 100 people, I put the next 100 people into my control group. That's not systematic, and that's not random. The reason why we want to randomly select people, and we're going to talk about this more in the next video, but the reason why we want to randomly select people is so that each outlier has the exact same chance of being in our sample, being in either our experimental or control groups, right? So think of it like this. In American politics today, most people are sort of moderate, right? Most people are like, yeah, I'm a Democrat, but, I'm not like a communist Democrat, right? I'm not like a super liberal Democrat, right? Most Republicans are like, yeah, I'm a Republican, I'm conservative. I don't, I have my qualms with things Democrats do, but I don't believe in QAnon, and I kind of think Trump is killing our vibe, right? But there are very much super communist liberals in our country, and there are very much super crazy build the wall Republicans. Or not Republicans, but super like conservatives. But so politically, right, you get most people are sort of kind of in the middle. Like they're like, all right, yeah, I don't think we need to go that far, right? But then you get some of these people who are absolutely just like way bonkers on the extremes, right? And so if I were to randomly select people, by the law of randomness, there's an equal chance that for every crazy, like QAnon believing, Trump thumping, hardcore, Hillary hating conservative I include in our sample, there will be also a blue bleeding blah 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 communist having Marxist liberal, right, to get into our sample, in addition to mostly having people who are in the middle. So that gives us an equal opportunity for outliers to sort of cancel each other out, and for us to get a more representative sample. It eliminates bias, all right, by being random. Every person there has the same chance of getting into our sample. It eliminates systematic bias, right? Because let's say I asked for a spreadsheet of participants before I randomly assign them to my control and experimental group, and the person who compiled the spreadsheet did it by whoever showed up first. Well, it may be that there might be some other factors associated with, well, maybe liberals show up earlier than conservatives, or maybe it's the other way around, right? If you've seen some of these Trump rallies, right? Some of those people camp out there way longer than some people do for an iPhone, okay? So anyway, there could be other factors that cause systematic bias, right? It could be that the spreadsheet was sorted by age. It could be that the spreadsheet was sorted by race. Oh my gosh, just think about that, right? Let's say they collected racial data and they put a B for black, and they put a W for white, and they put an H for Hispanic, even though Hispanic is not a race, it's an ethnicity, but we often collect them together, right? Race and ethnicity. So, right, and now they sort the list, right, by race, and the researcher doesn't know that, and they just take the first half of those people and they pop them in experimental group, and then the next half pop them in the control group. Well, now you're going to have a predominantly black and Hispanic experimental group and a white control group, right? And we know, based on history, that political affiliation and voting history and political participation varies significantly among those demographics, right? So that's seriously going to systematic bias. It's going to super duper mess with our data. So randomization, if you randomize that, no matter how the list is sorted, you're still randomizing it. There's an equal chance of any outlier or common occurrence ending up in either of the two groups. I hope that makes sense to you. We'll explain this again further in the next video. And so sometimes you'll hear the word RTC, or the phrase RTC, or the acronym RTC. That stands for a randomized controlled trial. That is the same as saying a random experiment. A randomized, all right, randomly selected, controlled, you have a control group, trial, which is another way of saying experiment or test, whatever. A randomized controlled trial, or RTC, right? So when you had Dr. Fauci, when he was being grilled about like, oh, so why don't you give hydrochloroquine and zinc a chance? And then Dr. Fauci said, because all I ever trust are RTCs, or randomized controlled trials. That's all I will trust when I advise the entire country on what to do. And these people are grilling this person who said, all I trust are hardcore randomized experiments, and they say, well, some doctor in Kentucky made a YouTube video about when you take enough zinc with hydrochloroquine, it works. The doctor has maybe 15 patients. Dr. Fauci says, was it a randomized controlled trial? No. What have randomized controlled trials showed us about hydrochloroquine? It doesn't work. Yet, leaders of our country don't care. Some politicians just don't care about science. But hey, at least we all have video games, right? And phones and the Kardashians. The nice thing about experiments is they allow us to say, oh, I'm pretty sure one thing causes another thing. Now, we can never say with 100% certainty that this will cause this, but we can say, hey, in our experiment, there seemed to be some relationship of when we put this thing before that thing, then there's changes, right? And we call that causal inference. We can infer that there's some sort of a causal effect, right? We can't say with 100% certainty that one thing will cause the other, but we have some sort of inference. We can say, hey, we're pretty sure that there's some sort of good relationship here. We need to keep on testing this, or we can start using this now. Remember, nothing in science is ever 100% sure. The good thing about the scientific method is we say, there can always be doubt. We must always doubt everything, which can sometimes lead to a little bit of inefficiency, but it is the safest way to go about it. Never get complacent in what we know, right? Always question things. The nice thing about causal inference and the good thing about using randomization is that we avoid spuriousness or a third variable, meaning that when you, like, let's go back to that example of where the person who compiled the spreadsheet of our respondents to a survey, and they took the spreadsheet before we assigned them to our control and experimental groups before we would send them the survey, right? They accidentally had the filter thing on, or they had the sort icon on one column for race that did it by alphabetical order. So everyone that had B in the race ethnicity column, right, were at the very top, and everyone with a W were at the very bottom. Because I don't think there's like a race that starts with Z. If there is, you should let me know. And so we do our experiment, and then we see all these crazy differences, and we're like, whoa, whatever this treatment that we have works really well. Well, it turns out that race and ethnicity was actually the third variable there causing the differences, being responsible for a lot of the differences. And we didn't catch that because we didn't randomize, right? So we call that relationship spurious when we mistake a relationship for something else, where we mistake something else for a relationship. So third variable causes spurious relationships, right? So that's the same thing. They're related when you say those two things. So earlier when I used that example of the ride-along study that I was doing with my best friend, Dr. Mathna, I mentioned that was actually a quasi-experimental design. And the reason for that is we use a quasi-experimental design when we cannot fulfill the classic three elements for some reason. Sometimes it's because of resources, sometimes it's just because of other feasibility issues, sometimes it's because of the people you have access to. And in those cases, we try our best to get to make it as rigorous as possible, but for some feasibility reason, practicality reason, or the type of question you're asking, you just cannot fulfill it. And in that case, it's still an experiment, but it's a quasi-experiment. So sometimes we cannot have randomization. Other times it's because we're only doing post-test. The other times we only have an experimental group and we don't have a control group, or we only have 2 experimental groups, right? And so in that case, they are quasi-experimental. But what we're going to focus on today in terms of the quasi-experimental group is when we have an experiment where randomization is not possible. That's going to be the main focus of today's video, because the other ones, it's just, you're like, all right, great. Well, this is what we're doing now. But we really need to delve a little deeper into the non-equivalent groups, okay? And so the 2 things that we're going to talk about are non-equivalent groups and then time series designs. And maybe we will clickety-clack. Clickety-clack. Okay. Non-equivalent groups, again, non-equivalent. Take that as you can't randomize, or your control and experimental groups for some reason are not equivalent, okay? So what we do then is when we can't randomize, we try our best to use aggregate matching or some sort of matching scenario. To give you an example, right, let's think about hotspots policing. Hotspots policing is when you have a neighborhood that has a lot of crime in it, and you send the police there. You don't necessarily tell them to arrest anyone, but they go there, they drive around, they get out of their cars, they walk around, and then their presence reduces the chances to commit crime, and therefore you see less crime, okay? And so let's try to study that now. Well, the problem is that you have a neighborhood, but you don't have an exact same neighborhood as that one, right? Let's say you have neighborhood. So let's say here is a city, right? Here are different neighborhoods, okay? I know this looks whack, but let's pretend these are our neighborhoods, and let's see, different color. Pow! Here's a hotspot. Here's a hotspot. Here's a hotspot, and here's a hotspot. And now you randomly selected this hotspot and this hotspot to be, or no, you didn't, oh, damn it. So you realize that this hotspot is kind of similar to this hotspot in terms of the type of people who live there, the socioeconomic status, the way that the environmental design is and stuff like that. There's like bridges or whatever, the types of crimes that are committed there, whatever. And these 2 hotspots are kind of similar, right? So now when you send your police officers, you might say, okay, well, I'm going to make this in my experimental group and this in my experimental group. And we're going to put these 2 in my control group, because this one and this one are similar, and this one and this one are similar. So we have 2 of the same kinds in our experimental group, and the other 2 in our control group. So now we sort of matched our groups, but they're still not exactly equivalent, right? It's not randomized. It's not perfect, but it's very hard work, and it's kind of close. It's closest we can get it, right? So we exert as much control over making things equivalent. And that's known as aggregate matching, right? This is also often used when you're trying to study the impacts of drug treatment programs or some sort of like cognitive behavioral therapy in prisons, right? We know that when you send inmates through cognitive behavioral therapy while they're in prison, especially right when they're about to leave prison, you actually have some good chances at reducing recidivism, meaning the chances that they would come back to prison within the next 3 years. And so, and I think it reduces about like 40%, depending on what the study is, what the crime, what the context. But the thing though is, you can't take one person and duplicate them. You can't clone people yet, right? And so what you do is you say, okay, well, here's person A. We want to put them in our cognitive behavioral therapy group. What's another person in the prison here who's similar to them? And we'll just study them as well. right? We'll put them in the control group, right? So you match them, aggregate matching, but it's not equivalent. Cohort designs are when you, okay, so this is a time series design, but it's also non-equivalent because essentially what I'm trying to study, so I'll give you an example. Let's say as people graduate from SUNY Oswego, as seniors graduate from SUNY Oswego, the professors give them all a survey to find out how they felt about the class, how they felt about the program, what their jobs aspirations are, what did they learn, how did they find the internships, and blah, blah, blah. We ask them various amounts of questions, right? Because we want to know if the changes that we're implementing as we change the program or add new things or make things better, hire new faculty, we want to see if all those independent variables we're adding into the equation impacts the way that seniors who are leaving or graduating feel about our program, right? And so we can't send individual people through the program every year as we are making changes. But what we can do is we can ask seniors right before they graduate the same sets of questions. Because again, it's not equivalent, but it gives us some controllability. Well, these are all seniors, right, about to graduate college, so they all have very similar situations going on. Yes, there's differences. Yes, it's not as good as randomization. Yes, it's not as good as aggregate matching, but it still gives us a good benchmark. It gives us an idea of how our seniors leaving our program feeling about things. And when we plot the perception averages on a chart with every year, right? So let's say here we have a timeline. This is 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025, 2026, 2027, 2028. I don't know. And so let's say we're just looking at one variable here, and we're saying, how do you feel about your job preparedness? Do you feel prepared for your job, right? And here it was an ordinal question, so you could answer either very prepared, which is a 5, or not prepared at all, which is a 0, and then you get 1, 2, 3, 4 in between there, right? And so let's say the average for, let's do this, clickety-clack, clickety-clack. Let's say the average for 2020 was around here, between 2 and a 3, 2021, similar, 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025, 2026. There you go, right? And so now you can say, oh, cute. Well, we can see sort of how cohort perceptions evolved over time on preparedness for the real world, right? And we might be able to say, oh, this is when we hired Professor Cohen. Yeah, he comes in here and he makes everything better. Just kidding, right? But the upward trend did start after I was hired, because this is when I started here. So I'm already doing great things for this department. Anyways, so a time series design is when you take a bunch of cross-sectional data pieces and you put them on a timeline. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but so with a cohort design, right, you have groups of people who have very similar things in common going through a certain stage in life. But a time series is a lot more disorganized in a way that you're taking a bunch of cross-sectional data and you're organizing it into a timeline. So you don't have quite as much control over your groups as you would with a cohort. So let me give you an example, right? So let's say in how about this? Let's say in 1981, whoops-a-daisy, we implemented sentencing guidelines, So sentencing guidelines. Okay, sentencing guidelines were implemented in 1981. And so we wanted to see, okay, well, now instead of a judge being a total racist and just being like, okay, well, you're black, so you're going to go to jail for 40 years. Oh, you're white, you go to jail for 2 years, right? And so sentencing guidelines would make it so the judges can't do that anymore. So now we're looking at, okay, well, let's look at white people's overall sentences for the same type of crime. So let's say here we say murder. Actually, no, murder is too. Let's say, drug use, drug possession, like high quantity drug possession. I don't know. Okay. So we're looking at, we see the average here. So here's our graph again. Let's say this is 10 years, this is 0 years. So now we're looking at the average for white people in the years leading up to 81, and then white people, the years leading beyond 81. So here we go, white people average. So white people average, 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 white people average. Okay? And now we're looking at, okay, well, what about, let's look at people whose race is black. All right, so we look here, okay, leading up to 81, okay, all right, and boom. Right, actually, that's a horrible color that I just used. We'll add some pizzazz. Ooh, that's like the LA Lakers. Go Lakers, go! Oh, Kobe. That was sad. I don't really like basketball, but it was sad when Kobe died. Also, the Minnesota Vikings. But here we go. So now we say, okay, over time, here's the white average, right? Right. So now we say, okay, did sentencing guidelines work? Well, our control group, which is, there we go. Our control group then, which is this side of the equation, right? Before and after, right? Our control group says, okay, well, things are kind of going the same way here. And then all of a sudden we introduce our independent variable and all of a sudden things are different. Well, I would say, yeah, that works, right? So that's a time series. It's slightly different from a cohort, because a cohort you're looking at is groups of people who have very similar things in common, right? As they're moving throughout time. Or, sorry, you're looking at groups of people as they're coming through one point in time. Whereas with a time series, you're just saying, okay, at this time, in 1979, everyone who was arrested for this level of drug possession, what was their sentence given? In 1980, everyone who was arrested and sentenced with this drug possession, what was the sentence given, right? It's a little less control over who's included. And so an interrupted time series is when you look at some sort of thing that was implemented right here. And you look at before and after. And that is that. Stay strong, and remember, chill vibes.